We like to believe we know our neighbors. We trust the local shopkeeper, the friendly butcher, the person who serves us our daily bread. We build our communities on a fragile foundation of familiarity and good faith. But what happens when that faith is a mask for an unspeakable evil? What happens when a place of nourishment becomes a source of nightmares? This is the story of a predator who hid in plain sight, a man who turned the forgotten and the innocent into a monstrous secret that an entire town was forced to swallow. It is a tale of a darkness so profound, it was served up with a smile day after day. Before we lift the lid on this horrifying case, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell. You will need to know you're not alone as we uncover the truth about the butcher from hell. The Port Blossom Seafood Market, even in the pre-dawn gloom, was a city within a city, a vibrant, beating heart that began its day while the rest of the world slept. The air, thick and heavy with the briny, primordial scent of the sea, was a chaotic symphony of sounds. The diesel rumble of fishing trawlers returning to port, the shouts of fishermen in a dozen different languages, the rhythmic, percussive scrape of ice being shoveled into massive, insulated bins, the screech of gulls circling overhead. It was a place of life, of sustenance, a place where the city came to be fed. It was the last place on earth anyone would expect to find a piece of a dead girl. The discovery was made by a grizzled, old sanitation worker named Gus, a man whose face was a roadmap of a long, hard life. He was making his usual rounds in the grim, pre-dawn hours, the city still cloaked in a gray, industrial twilight. In a large, overflowing garbage bin in the alley behind the main market hall, a place that reeked of fish guts, discarded crates, and waxed paper, he saw it. At first, he thought it was a discarded mannequin part, a piece of trash from one of the tourist shops on the pier. But as his headlamp beam cut through the darkness, he saw the toenails. They were painted a bright, defiant, sapphire blue. And he knew, with a sudden, lurching sickness in the pit of his stomach, that he was not looking at a piece of plastic. It was a single, human foot severed cleanly at the ankle. Detective Anya Sharma stood at the edge of the alley, the yellow police tape a jarring, almost violent, slash of color against the grimy, pre-war brick. The scent of bleach, which the first responders had used to cordon off the immediate area, did little to mask the underlying, almost overwhelming stench of fish and decay. Anya was a detective forged in the crucible of the city's darkest secrets. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a quiet, intense demeanor that often unnerved her colleagues. But cases involving children, or those on the cusp of adulthood, always landed differently. They landed personally. Her own younger sister, Maya, had vanished without a trace 12 years ago. She had been 15. It was a cold case, a ghost that lived in the periphery of Anya's vision, a silent, constant companion, the driving force behind her relentless, almost obsessive, dedication to her job. Every time a young girl went missing, every time a young body was found, it was a painful, visceral echo of her own, unresolved tragedy. It was a wound that could not heal. The Emmy is on his way, her partner, a veteran detective named Ben Carter, said, his voice a low, tired rumble. He was a good, solid cop, a man who provided a steady, calming presence to Anya's intensity. But the initial look, the cut is clean, professional, like from a butcher's saw, or something similar, not a hack job. Anya knelt, her gaze fixed on the foot, which was now being carefully, almost reverently, photographed by the forensics team. The blue nail polish was chipped, a small, heartbreaking detail of a life that had been anything but pristine. "We got any new missing persons reports?" she asked, her voice tight. The question a familiar, painful ritual. "A few," Ben said, flipping through his notebook, the usual tragic churn. "But one fits the age range and the location. A 16-year-old runaway named Lily Petrova. She's been living on the streets in this district for about 6 months. Known to the local outreach center. A social worker reported her missing 3 days ago when she didn't show up for her weekly meal and art therapy session." "Lily?" Anya whispered, the name a heavy weight on her tongue. Another forgotten girl. Another life that had slipped through the cracks. Another ghost. The next 48 hours were a frustrating, exhaustive blur of police work. Anya and Ben canvassed the Port Blossom Market, a sprawling, labyrinthine world of over 100 different vendors, from grizzled, old fishermen selling their daily catch-off their boats to trendy, high-end shops selling artisanal smoked salmon and imported oysters. They showed Lily's photo, a grainy, hopeful-looking picture from a school ID, a picture from a life that no longer existed to everyone. Most of the vendors were a wall of hardened, close-lipped indifference. The street kids who lived in the district were a part of the landscape, an inconvenient and persistent problem they had learned to ignore. But a few remembered her. A kind-hearted, elderly baker who had given her day-old bread. A young woman who ran a coffee cart who said Lily was a sweet, quiet girl who loved to draw in a small, tattered sketchbook she always carried. And then there was Silas Croft. He was the owner of the Gilded Scale, one of the most respected and popular fishmongers in the market. His shop was a picture of pristine, old-world quality. The tiles on the walls and floor were a gleaming, spotless white. The large, curved glass display case was free of a single smudge. And the man himself looked like he had been carved from the same sturdy, reliable material as the docks themselves. He was in his late 50s, with a quiet, gentle demeanor, a powerful, stocky build, and hands that were as large as shovels but as skilled and as graceful with a filleting knife as a surgeon's were with a scalpel. He was a pillar of the market community, a man known for his honesty, his fairness, and the quality of his product. He looked at Lily's photo with a sad, paternal sigh, his brow furrowing with a look of genuine sorrow. "Ah yes, the little artist," he said, his voice a soft, low rumble. "She would come by sometimes. A very quiet, polite girl. I would give her some of our fish cakes. They're made from the trimmings of the day's catch. Can't let anything go to waste, you know." She said they were her favorite. He shook his head, a look of genuine sadness in his eyes. "It's a tragedy, what happens to these children. The city should do more. A girl like that, she should be in a home with a family." He was helpful, compassionate, and utterly, completely unremarkable. Just another good man saddened by a bad world. The investigation into the foot yielded few clues. The cut, the Emmy confirmed, was made by a high-end, serrated, reciprocating blade, the kind used in professional meat and fish processing. The DNA confirmed, with a tragic certainty, that the victim was, indeed, the missing girl Lily Petrova. But there were no other clues, no other leads. Lily had simply vanished, and the only part of her to reappear was a single, blue-toenailed foot. The case was in danger of going cold, another tragic but unsolvable murder in a city full of them. Anya felt a familiar, desperate rage building inside her. She would not let Lily become another ghost in her collection, another file in a dusty, forgotten cabinet. She would not let her become another Maya. The chapter ends 1 week later. The city is moving on. The market is bustling. The story of the girl in the dumpster is already old news, a fleeting, grim headline replaced by the next day's tragedies. Anya is in her office late at night, the room a chaotic landscape of case files and empty coffee cups. She is staring at a board covered with photos of Lily, maps of the harbor district, and a single, heartbreakingly small forensic photo of a severed foot. The blue toenails seem to mock her with their silent, unanswered questions. Then, her phone rings, the sound a jarring, violent intrusion into the quiet despair of the room. It's Ben, his voice grim, devoid of its usual tired warmth. "Anya," he says, "you need to get down here. The outreach center just called. Another one of their girls is missing, a 15-year-old named Maria Sanchez. She was last seen 2 days ago, heading towards the market." Anya closes her eyes, a wave of cold, sickening dread washing over her. This wasn't a one-time act of violence. This was the beginning of a hunt. The butcher of Port Blossom had claimed another victim. The clock was ticking, again. And for Anya, it was a sound she knew all too well. It was the sound of her own personal hell. The disappearance of a second girl, Maria, transformed the investigation from a single, tragic homicide into a full-blown serial killer hunt. The news, though kept from the public for the first 48 hours, sent a shockwave of cold, professional dread through the department. The butcher of Port Blossom, a name whispered in the squad room and scrawled on a whiteboard in the hastily assembled incident room, was not a one-time monster. He was a predator, and he was actively hunting. A special task force was officially formed, pulling the best and the brightest detectives from every division. Anya, with her obsessive dedication and her intimate, almost painful knowledge of the district's forgotten corners, was placed at its center. The Port Blossom Market, which just a week ago had been a place of vibrant, chaotic life, now felt like a hunting ground, and every one of its hundreds of vendors, every shadow in its labyrinthine alleys, was a potential suspect. The investigation into the lives of the victims revealed a heartbreakingly consistent and tragic pattern. Like Lily, Maria was a runaway, a girl who had been cast adrift by a broken family and an indifferent, overburdened system. The task force began the grim, secret work of building a census of the forgotten girls of Port Blossom, the dozens of young, vulnerable runaways who lived in the shadows of the harbor, in abandoned warehouses, under piers, in the hidden, dark corners of the city. They were the perfect victims for a predator, invisible, voiceless, and unlikely to be missed, at least not right away, not by the right people. The forensics lab, meanwhile, was conducting a wider, more desperate search for evidence. With so few leads from the first crime scene, a single, clean, and forensically sterile foot, Anya had authorized a controversial and wide-ranging series of tests. She had ordered the collection and analysis of everything from the alley where the foot was found, soil samples, water runoff from the storm drains, and, in a move that some of her superiors saw as a desperate, resource-draining long shot, a random sampling of food products from the market's garbage bins and even from some of the vendors themselves. The theory was a fragile one, that the killer, likely a market worker, might have inadvertently left a microscopic trace of the victim's DNA on something he handled or sold. The first results from the lab were a series of frustrating dead ends. The soil samples showed nothing. The water samples were a contaminated mess. The food samples came back clean, one after another. The case was stalling, and the clock on Maria's life, and the lives of the other forgotten girls, was ticking. Then the unthinkable happened. A young, ambitious forensic technician named Kenji, running a new, highly sensitive DNA sequencing test on the last batch of samples, got a hit. A big one. It was so unexpected, so monstrous, that he ran the test again, convinced it was a contaminated sample, a catastrophic error on his part. He ran it a third time. The result was always the same. The test was on a batch of fish cakes that had been collected as part of the random sampling from several of the market's most popular vendors. The fish cakes from one of those vendors, the pristine, respected, and universally liked The Gilded Scale, had come back positive for human DNA. And it was a perfect 1,000,000,000 match to the DNA of the first victim, Lily Petrova. The initial reaction in the lab, and then in the task force, was one of stunned, sickening disbelief. It had to be a mistake. Anya herself refused to believe it at first. But when Kenji showed her the data, the clean, undeniable results of the sequencing, the horrifying, almost unimaginable truth began to dawn on them. This was not a trace amount of DNA from a contaminated cutting board or a poorly washed knife. The human DNA was a significant, integral component of the product itself. The butcher wasn't just killing these girls and dismembering their bodies. He was processing them. He was mixing their flesh into the food he was selling, with a quiet, paternal smile, to an unsuspecting public. The scope of the crime had just expanded exponentially. This was not just a series of murders. It was a public desecration of almost unimaginable horror, a level of psychopathy that was almost mythical in its depravity. Silas Croft, the quiet, gentle, and helpful fishmonger, the man who had spoken of Lily with such sad, paternal kindness, was now the prime and only suspect. The perfect, impenetrable wall of his normalcy had just been sledgehammered into dust. Anya felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to steady herself on a desk. She remembered his words. "I would give her some of our fish cakes." She said they were her favorite. The memory, once a small, touching detail of a kind man, was now a chilling, monstrous confession. The case against Silas Croft was now the task force's only focus, but it was a case built on a single, horrifying, and almost unbelievable forensic fact. They needed more. They needed to connect him directly to the victims, to prove that he was not just an unwitting vendor of a contaminated product, but the butcher himself. A covert, 24/7 surveillance operation was immediately established on Silas and his shop. For days they watched him, and what they saw was a man of meticulous, almost monastic routine. He arrived at his shop before dawn. He cleaned his station with a surgeon's precision. He served his customers with a quiet, gentle courtesy. He left after dark. He lived in a small, neat apartment above the shop. He had no friends, no family that they could find. He was a man who lived only for his work. He was a perfect, impenetrable wall of normalcy. While the surveillance continued, Anya delved into his past, searching for the cracks in that wall. She found them. Silas Croft was not his real name. He had changed it 30 years ago, after a brief stint in a juvenile facility. His birth name was Simon Croft, and under that name she found a sealed juvenile record. As a teenager, Simon Croft had been arrested for a series of brutal, ritualistic attacks on stray animals. A court-appointed psychiatrist at the time, in a report that Anya read with a growing sense of cold dread, had described him as a boy with a profound lack of empathy and a disturbing clinical curiosity about the deconstruction of living things. He had served a short sentence and had then disappeared from the system, re-emerging years later as the quiet, respectable Silas Croft. The dark, violent past had been buried, but the monster had not disappeared. He had just become more patient. With this new information, and the ever-present, ticking clock of the missing girl, Maria, they knew they had to move. They couldn't risk waiting for another foot to appear in a dumpster. A no-knock warrant was secured for his shop and his apartment. The raid was a tense, silent operation in the dead of night. The market was a ghost town, its stalls shrouded in darkness, the only sound the distant lapping of the water against the docks. The team breached the door of the Gilded Scale with a silent, hydraulic tool. Inside, the shop was as pristine as it was during the day. But behind a false wall in the large, walk-in freezer at the back of his shop, a wall that was cold to the touch, they found the butcher's lair. It was not a dirty, bloody slaughterhouse. It was a sterile, stainless steel processing room, as clean and as organized as a laboratory. And it was here that they found the final, irrefutable proof they needed. In a small, locked chest, they found a collection of trophies, a gruesome library of stolen lives. There was a small, hand-drawn sketchbook that belonged to Lily. There was a cheap, plastic bracelet with the name Maria on it. And there were 6 other small, personal items of faded red ribbon, a single, tarnished silver earring, a worn-out library card, a child's tooth. A gruesome collection that confirmed their worst, most unimaginable fears. He had not killed 2 girls. He had killed 8. And Maria, the girl they had been so desperately searching for, was already one of them. The butcher of Port Blossom had been hunting in their city for a very, very long time. The case against Silas Croft was now the task force's singular, obsessive focus. But it was a case built on a single, horrifying, and almost unbelievable forensic fact: the DNA in the fish cakes and a 30-year-old juvenile record. They needed more. They needed to connect him directly to the victims in the present day, to prove that he was not just an unwitting vendor of a contaminated product, but the butcher himself. A smart defense attorney could create enough reasonable doubt to turn their monstrous certainty into a courtroom farce. A covert, 24/7 surveillance operation was established on Silas and his shop. It was a frustrating, almost maddening exercise in watching a man be utterly, completely normal. For days they watched him, and what they saw was a man of meticulous, almost monastic routine. He arrived at his shop before dawn, a solitary, powerful figure moving through the still dark market. He cleaned his station with a surgeon's precision, hosing down the white-tiled floors, polishing the glass of the display case until it was invisible. He served his customers, the regulars who had trusted him for years, with a quiet, gentle courtesy, offering a small, sad smile and a nod. He left after dark, locking up his shop with a series of heavy, old-fashioned padlocks. He lived in a small, neat apartment above the shop. He had no friends, no family that they could find. He was a man who lived only for his work. He was a perfect, impenetrable wall of normalcy. While the surveillance continued, a frustrating vigil, Anya delved deeper into his past, searching for the cracks in that wall. She found them, buried in the dusty, microfiled archives of the state juvenile justice system. Silas Croft was not his real name. He had legally changed it 30 years ago, the day after his 18th birthday, the day he had been released from the juvenile facility. His birth name was Simon Croft, and under that name she found a sealed juvenile record. As a teenager, Simon Croft had been arrested for a series of brutal, ritualistic attacks on stray animals. The details, which Anya read with a growing sense of cold dread, were a terrifying blueprint for the crimes he was committing today. A court-appointed psychiatrist at the time, in a report that was both prescient and chilling, had described him as a boy with a profound and incurable lack of empathy, a narcissistic personality, and a disturbing clinical curiosity about the deconstruction of living things. He had served a short, mandatory sentence and had then disappeared from the system, re-emerging years later as the quiet, respectable, and utterly unremarkable Silas Croft. The dark, violent past had been buried, but the monster had not disappeared. He had just become more patient, more disciplined. With this new information, and the ever-present, ticking clock of the missing girl, Maria, a clock that with every passing hour felt more and more like a funeral dirge, they knew they had to move. They couldn't risk waiting for another piece of a girl to appear in a dumpster. They couldn't risk another victim. A no-knock warrant was secured for his shop and his apartment, the request fast-tracked by a judge who had turned white as a sheet while reading the probable cause affidavit. The raid was a tense, silent operation in the dead of night. The market was a ghost town, its stalls shrouded in darkness. The only sound the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn and the gentle lapping of the water against the docks. The SWAT team, clad in black, moved like shadows, their movements fluid and practiced. They breached the door of the gilded scale with a silent, hydraulic tool, a spider's kiss that opened the lock without a sound. Inside, the shop was as pristine as it was during the day, the air cold and smelling faintly of bleach and the sea. But behind a false wall in the large, walk-in freezer at the back of his shop, a wall that was cold to the touch and covered in a thin, almost invisible layer of frost, they found the butcher's lair. It was not a dirty, bloody slaughterhouse. It was a sterile, stainless steel processing room, as clean and as organized as a laboratory. The walls were lined with hooks, saws, and a collection of knives of every shape and size, all gleaming and clean. In the center of the room was a large, industrial-grade meat grinder, and in the corner, a massive, custom-built incinerator. This was a place of disassembly, of deconstruction, of erasure. And it was here that they found the final, irrefutable proof they needed. In a small, locked, and refrigerated metal chest, they found a collection of trophies, a gruesome library of stolen lives. There was a small, hand-drawn sketchbook, its pages filled with beautiful, delicate drawings of flowers and birds that belonged to Lily. There was a cheap, plastic, beaded bracelet with the name Maria on it, the kind of trinket a teenage girl would treasure. And there were 6 other small, personal items of faded red ribbon, a single, tarnished silver earring, a worn-out library card, a child's tooth, a small silver cross, and a single pressed wildflower. A gruesome collection that confirmed their worst, most unimaginable fears. He had not killed 2 girls. He had been hunting in their city for a very, very long time. And in the incinerator, they found the ashes and the bone fragments of his victims, the final, terrible evidence of his monstrous recycling process. Maria, the girl they had been so desperately searching for, was already one of them. The butcher of Port Blossom was not a recent phenomenon. He was a veteran, a master of his horrific craft, a predator who had been living and hunting in the heart of their city for years, a monster hiding in the plain, comforting sight of a friendly, neighborhood fishmonger. The true scale of his evil was only just beginning to be understood. The interrogation of Silas Croft was a descent into a cold, dark, an airless place. He was not a ranting madman. He was not a panicked criminal caught in a lie. He was a creature of profound, unnerving calm. He sat opposite Anya in the stark, gray, soundproofed interrogation room, his large, powerful hands resting quietly on the steel table. His face, the same kind, paternal face that had offered a sad sigh for the little artist, was a mask of serene, almost benevolent indifference. He was a predator at rest, observing her with a quiet, clinical curiosity. For hours, he denied everything. He answered every question with a simple, unwavering no. He met every piece of evidence with a calm, almost pitying smile. The juvenile record? A troubled youth, a different person. The hidden room? A private space for my work, nothing more. The trophies? Trinkets I've found over the years in the market. I felt sorry for the lost children, so I kept them. He was a master of deception. His lies as smooth and as polished as the river stones on a beach. He was an unbreachable wall of quiet, sociopathic denial. The interrogation was a psychological battle of wills. The male detectives on the task force had tried using aggression, using threats, using every trick in the interrogation playbook. He had met their rage with an infuriating, condescending calm. He was impenetrable. Anya knew she had to use a different approach. She had spent the night before the interrogation not sleeping, but immersing herself in the mind of her opponent. She had reread the 30-year-old psychiatric report, a chillingly prescient document that had described the young Simon Croft as a boy with a profound narcissistic personality, a complete lack of empathy, and a deep-seated need for control and a sense of superiority. She knew that Silas Croft, the man, was driven by the same engine as Simon Croft, the boy. She entered the interrogation room alone, against the protest of her captain. She did not bring a file. She did not bring a list of questions. She sat opposite him, and for a long time, she said nothing, simply meeting his calm, steady gaze with her own. Finally, she spoke, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You think you're clever," she began, leaning forward slightly. "You think you're a genius, hiding in plain sight for all these years, building your little kingdom in the market. You think you're a god, Silas, deciding who lives, who dies, who gets to be remembered." A flicker of interest in his eyes. He was listening. "But you're sloppy," she continued, her voice dripping with a carefully manufactured contempt. "You left pieces behind. The foot in the dumpster? That was a mistake. A moment of arrogance. You wanted us to find it. You wanted to see if we were smart enough to play your game." He remained silent, but a faint, almost imperceptible, smile touched the corners of his lips. "And the fish cakes," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "That was your masterpiece, wasn't it? The ultimate act of contempt. Feeding the forgotten to the forgetful. It's a brilliant piece of performance art, in a sick, twisted way. But you underestimated the science. You underestimated me. You thought you were invisible. But I see you, Silas. I see every pathetic, little secret you've been hiding." She wasn't appealing to his empathy. He had none. She was appealing to his ego, to his profound narcissistic pride in his work. She was challenging his status as a master. And then he broke. But it was not a breakdown of remorse. It was a confession of pride, a dam of arrogant silence that finally burst, releasing a torrent of cold, chilling words. He began to speak, his voice a calm, even almost professorial monologue. He detailed his crimes with a chilling, dispassionate lack of emotion. He explained his monstrous, twisted philosophy. He saw the runaway girls, the forgotten of the city, the little sparrows, as he called them, as waste. They were a tragic but inevitable byproduct of a broken system. "I was not a murderer," he explained, his eyes alight with a cold, righteous fire. "I was a recycler. I was taking their meaningless, painful lives, lives that society had already discarded, and I was turning them into something that nourished the very community that had ignored and abandoned them. It was perfect, closed-loop system, an act of profound, ecological and social balance. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a philosopher, a social engineer. In his mind, he was committing an act of profound, almost artistic social commentary. He then, with a terrifying, almost bored sense of administrative detail, told them where he had disposed of the other bodies, or what was left of them. He confirmed the full, horrific count of 8 victims, a string of disappearances of forgotten girls that went back over a decade. He described each girl, not with sadness, but with the detached affection of a collector describing a specimen. Lily was the artist. Maria was the dancer. There was the singer, the reader, the dreamer. He had given them each a label, a purpose, a role in his grotesque collection. He confessed not because he felt guilt, but because he had finally been recognized. Anya, in challenging his genius, had paid him the ultimate compliment. He was no longer a quiet, anonymous fishmonger. He was the butcher of Port Blossom, a monster of mythic proportions. And in the cold, gray, windowless interrogation room, he was finally, and proudly, taking his bow. Anya sat in silence, the air thick and cold with the presence of an evil so profound, so absolute, it was almost a physical force. She had won the confession. She had brought a monster into the light. But she knew that the darkness she had just looked into would stay with her forever. The aftermath of Silas Croft's confession was a firestorm of public horror and revulsion. The city was forced to confront a truth so monstrous it was almost impossible to comprehend. The Port Blossom Market, the heart of the community, was closed indefinitely, a permanent, sprawling crime scene. The case became a national sensation, a modern-day Sweeney Todd story that exposed the dark, terrifying truth that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones hiding in plain sight. The recovery of the other victims' remains, from the various locations Silas had described, was a somber, difficult process. Each recovery was a small, tragic victory, a name given back to a forgotten girl. The trial was a formality. Silas was unrepentant to the very end, a silent, looming figure of pure, unadulterated evil. He was found guilty on all 8 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The final chapter focuses on Anya. The case is closed. The monster is caged. She is a hero, but she is not at peace. Catching Silas, bringing justice to his 8 victims, has not brought her own sister back. The ghost of Maya still haunts her. The final scene of the story takes place months later, at a newly dedicated memorial on the harbor front. It is a simple, elegant statue of a young girl looking out at the sea, and on the plaque at its base are the names of the 8 victims of the butcher of Port Blossom. Anya stands before the memorial, reading the names. She has brought them justice. She has made sure they are no longer forgotten. But her own personal quest, the hunt for her own lost sister, continues. She looks out at the gray, indifferent water of the harbor, a silent promise to her own ghost that she will never stop searching, that she will never be forgotten. The story ends on a note of somber, hard-won resolution, not triumphant victory.